Welcome to our second panel. This panel is about Arabic balagha, the most powerful weapon in front of Eurocentric literary theories. Our first speaker is Alexander Kay from Stanford University. Alexander Kay, Stanford University, received his PhD from Harvard University in Arabic and Islamic studies. His research interest moves over a wide range of topics within intellectual history of Arabic and Persian speaking world. He is an author of a number of articles on Arabic poetry and poetics, on the Quranic studies and I'jaz al-Quran, Arabic grammar and logic. He recently published a book, Language Between God and the Poets. The book explains classical Arabic theories about poetry. His talk is about describing and using classical Arabic poetics.
Hello, thank you all very much for coming. I'd like to also second everybody's thanks to Hani for organizing this. It's a conversation to which I hope to make a contribution that goes some way towards, again, like what Bilal was talking about this morning. It's this, how do we talk to people when all they want to talk to us about is Rumi and the 1001 Nights? Like, how do we, like, what are the things we can do in order to get into that conversation, while at the same time not letting that become some kind of instrumentalist drive? Like, the whole purpose of our work is just to try and find a new audience. So these kind of questions are some of the things I've been thinking about. The book that Ida mentioned, and I'm grateful for that introduction, is this book that's coming out with the University of California Press next month. And in July, and there's going to be an open access version, which is going to be free to download. I think what I might do, because we have a little bit of extra time from the withdrawal of one of the speakers, is just give you like a look at the table of contents. So what I've tried to do in the book is to go through all the necessary backwork and underpinnings that you need in order to explain the kinds of things that we, the people in this room, already know to an audience that doesn't necessarily speak English. And the reason I think this is so important is that the very words that we use when we start these conversations, whichever language we happen to be speaking in, have their own deep, long genealogies in specific histories that we need to do this work of unpacking. I mean, to a large extent, this is a whole book of several hundred pages, all about one word, ma'na. So I have a chapter on ilm al-lugha, I have a chapter on ilm al-kalam, chapter on ilm al-mantiq, and then a chapter on naqd al-shi'r, which is basically Abdul Qahir al-Jurjani. And the claim I want to make is that this is this scale of work that's needed for just one word. I mean, if you think of what happened when we were talking at the very beginning today, when Rebecca was giving her introduction to her project, one thing I noticed that happens in English is just that the word rhetoric and the word poetics, which are these two symbols for these two disciplines of scholarship, rhetoric and poetics, the distinction between which is entirely Aristotelian, and just doesn't necessarily connect to the concerns that we have. I mean, Aristotle had a very clear idea of rhetoric. It was to do with politics and persuasion. He had a somewhat less clear idea of poetics. You know, a very short book with some not very fully worked out ideas about mimesis and some sketchy remarks on metaphor. And but the subsequent generations that worked on those two concepts separately throughout European intellectual history have had such an effect that when we start talking about Arabic, you know, the words rhetoric and poetics start to cause problems for us. What interests me here is that that problem is not a problem, or was not a problem, for any of the scholars we work on. So if you're Ibn Sina, if you're Abdul Qahir al-Jurjani, particularly if you're Ibn Sina, and you're fully aware of the Aristotelian tradition, so you know the rhetoric and poetics, you read the rhetoric and poetics in Arabic, the translations are pretty decent, the ones that Ibn Sina was using. Like, Ibn Sina didn't have some kind of epistemological block or a break when it came to the rhetoric and poetics. Like, he didn't feel like his ability to talk about any of the questions that we're interested in was in any way constricted by this Aristotelian framework. He was perfectly capable of reworking it and explaining it and going on to lay out the ideas that he would. Same is true for Giorgiani. I mean, I think one of the arguments I make in the Poetics chapter is that you can see a kind of Aristotelian logical heritage in some of Abdul Qahir al-Jurjani's ideas about syntax and predication. And again, Abdul Qahir al-Jurjani didn't have a problem talking about poetry whilst knowing Aristotelian theory. The other thing I just wanted to flag up in the presentation is a special issue of the Journal of Abbasid Studies that's coming out over this summer, which is a whole series of, it's a special issue on Abdul Qahir al-Jurjani, and it basically continues the work that Layla's doing, and takes and tries to see what else we can say about the century or two after, and the kind of the gap between Giorgiani and the Sakaki Kazwini moment, and also what the best tools we have to explain what he was doing were. Okay. Sorry, I practiced that transition. It worked perfectly when I did it. There. Yes, this is the special issue of Giorgiani. So the book Language Between God and the Poets provides a genealogy that answers the question, what was classical Arabic literary theory? And the answer I give in the book is that classical Arabic literary theory, as encapsulated by Abdul Qahir al-Jurjani, was formalist, and it was constructed from a set of epistemological resources that are found in Arabic lexicography, theology, and philosophy. To translate that process of translating it into English was prolonged, and that was a comparative project. The next thing I want to try and do is to activate that classical Arabic project in a new anachronistic context. So Jahan Ramazani has noted, in terms of the history of literary criticism, that some poetry can be easier to describe later on. And what I think is important about that throwaway remark is that it separates the kind of inevitable symbiosis of a poetics and the poetry. Like, it separates, it just makes the point that it's not always the case that the poetics and the poetry go together all the time. And I think that this came up in Layla's presentation when she invoked the new critics in America as one of the ways that you could see, one of the avenues that you could read Giorgiani in conversation with. And again, when she was dealing with how ta'khir, how you could use it to look at the way Bayhaqi was separating two particular nouns within a sentence. He was kind of going against the expectations of Persian syntax to separate the two nouns, and that was going to give like a particular kind of impact on the reader. So again, that's taking a theory that Giorgiani designed as applicable to both Arabic and Persian and both prose and poetry, but Giorgiani didn't write it for Bayhaqi, obviously. The new critics, were doing criticism of poetry that wasn't written for the new critics. So as soon as we break that gap between them, we can do a lot more. What I'm really trying to do is take that initial break of the gap between them and pull the gap between Giorgiani and Bayhaqi and pull it even wider and kind of see what the reductio ad absurdum is when we pull those two things completely apart. Some of the resources that I've used when I've been thinking about this, and I should say that this is very preliminary research, and I'm not really at all sure where I'm going with it or what exactly is going to happen. One of the people that I've used is Helen Wendler, whose criticism of Seamus Heaney in particular Helen Wendler's criticism of Seamus Heaney in particular is very close to what Layla was doing with Bayhaqi. This idea that you can work through the particular grammatical choices that a poet makes in a line of poetry and use that to explain how the poetry is particularly powerful. This is a kind of formalism, like this kind of literary criticism is called formalism, that's slightly different from another recent famous intervention under the title Forms by Caroline Levine. And what Caroline Levine is doing in this book from a year or two ago is really looking at big forms across time. She's almost doing like a history of genre, like a sort of intellectual history, and it doesn't really work as well. I don't think. It doesn't work as well as when you come down to the syntax level and the sentence level. There was a recent special issue of PMLA with a load of people discussing and criticizing Caroline Levine's book on forms. And then another recent book about literary history that I'm going to come back to in the conclusion is by Joseph North. So these are some of the resources from outside the field that I've been using to think about. What I'd like to do now is take a couple of snapshots of Giorgiani, see how that might play out in some Arabic and Persian and English poetry, and then ask where that leaves us. So it's not just that Giorgiani does both prose and poetry, but he's prepared to spend pages and pages and pages and pages and pages talking about even just a little snatch or a phrase. So Abi Ahmad al-Haythani, my father is the most praiseworthy of the two heavy rains. Or Falam ara darghamani astaqa minkuma iraqan. I've never seen two lions fight harder than you two. So these are two of the lines that Giorgiani is interested in, and what are the tools that he develops in order to explain what's happening here. In the first instance, Giorgiani develops this way of talking about haqiqa, what I tend to translate as lexical accuracy, like the relationship between a vocal form and a mental content, a lafz and a ma'na, as they get enshrined in the dictionary. What we might call in English literal language, as opposed to what we might call in English metaphorical language. And what interests Giorgiani about the Abi Ahmed al-Ghaythani is that the two ways in which language exists, like language that's connected to the lexicon, language that is being used as if it were in the lexicon. Rain is the word that you use for the wet stuff that comes down from the sky. And the non-literal use of language, rain is a symbol for generosity because of the scale with which it, and what interests, but we know this, like we've seen this, metaphorical use of rain over and over again. What interests Giorgiani and what marks Giorgiani out as a critic is that he says, look, it's those two kinds of language are located together just in the dual form of the verb. So just like Wendler, he locates the affect as taking two different kinds of language and jamming them together in a particular morphological form. أن يدم المجاز إلى الحقيقة في عقد التثنية. With regards to the two lions fighting, again, it's the same principle. It's that one of these two lions is a lexically accurate lion, and the other lion is what we would call in English a metaphorical lion. And again, it's like if you think about this in terms of ordinary language, there are no actual lions fighting here at all. Right? This is poetry. Like, it's an image. He's talking about, two people fighting or two particularly brave people. Like, there's no actual reality. There's no reference. Like, this isn't language. This isn't ordinary language describing stuff that's actually happening. It's poetic language. And yet, in that poetic language, he identifies those same two ways in which language exists. Lexically accurate and non-lexically accurate. He says one of the lines is lexically accurate, and the other one isn't. So that was it's Farazdak and al-Buhtari. وبياض البازي أصدق حسنا إن تأملت من سواد الغراب. The whiteness of the falcon is, upon consideration, more truly beautiful than the black of the crow. This is Buhtari again. This is the other bit. This is the other little bit of Abdul Qahir's literary critical toolbox that I want to highlight, and I could not agree more with what Layla said about how he deliberately makes you read the entire book, right? He actually says at one point in the Dalail, I'm not going to give you a table of contents, you have to read the whole thing. And he's right, you do have to read the whole thing. So what he's doing, what his analysis of this line by al-Buhtari gives us as a tool that we can use to talk about poetry this is Giorgiani's idea that the ma'ani, they come in bundles. So each word or each noun has like a bundle of mental contents, a bundle of ma'ani that come with it. And then one of those mental contents is the essence. So here he's talking about the relative merits of old age and youth. The old age is the white hair, the youth is the black hair, the whiteness and the blackness. And what he's interested in is the way that, if you think of words as having bundles of mental content, so a lion, for example, the bundle of ma'ani that come with the word lion, it's like, it's brave, and it's got 4 legs, and it's got like, you know, tawny yellow hair and a big mane. Like, there's this whole bundle of mental contents that comes with the lafz Asad. And when you compare somebody to a lion, you're not comparing them to a lion because of their mane of yellow hair. You're comparing them to a lion because of the specific manner of bravery, which Giorgiani says is kind of essential to the lion. So what interests Giorgiani about this line is that the poet isn't selecting the kind of essential ma'ana from the bundle of ma'ani. He's deliberately using descriptions that are not central to the bundle of mental contents to which they belong in the lexicon. So whiteness isn't a central ma'ana for old age in the same way that bravery is a central ma'ana for lions, is what Giorgiani says. And whiteness isn't the central ma'ana. It's not the kind of chief essential ma'ana of a falcon, in the same way as bravery is the chief essential ma'ana of the lion. So what Giorgiani's interested in here is the way that each word in this metaphorical comparison has a bundle of ma'ani attached to it, and the poet is kind of deliberately using not quite the ones you would expect him to pick, and that's what makes the metaphor particularly powerful, Giorgiani thinks. So that's where the part of the presentation where I'm confident of what I'm doing ends. And from here on, it's a lot more experimental, and I will be very grateful, especially with this audience, with Persianists and people, for any corrections that people would like to offer. And actually, what I'm going to do here is take a presentation from Maziar Faridi, who gave a paper on Bijan Elahi at American Comparative Literature Association seminar that I organized a couple of months ago. And Maziar gave this paper on Bijan Elahi, in which he talked about Elahi's translations of Al-Hallaj. So that's the slide that I asked Maziar to borrow from his ACLA presentation. This is the beginning of Elahi's translation of a poem by Hallaj. So the question I have, like the thing I've been struggling with, is we can build a literary critical toolbox using Giorgiani. We can apply it to Bayhaqi, and can we apply it to this? Is the question. Like, can we apply that literary critical toolbox, the things that Giorgiani was doing to talk about Al-Farazdak and Al-Buhtari, can we apply it to this kind of poetry? Yeah. Yeah, and I'm not absolutely sure. I'm not absolutely sure that you could take the crying, like if you look in the second verse of Elahi, Tab looked for Hawa, you could take the kind of the crying cloud, and you could pull out the set of the set of ma'ani that image has, and you could ask whether Elahi is like picking the particular ones. You could track how much of this poem is using the words like as they exist in the dictionary. you could see maybe the tension between Che Khabar, which is very much ordinary language as per the dictionary, and the rest of the poem, which is much more abstract. I think it's equally difficult with Al-Hallaj, because the action in Al-Hallaj doesn't seem to be happening in the same way as it happens in Al-Bakhtari. Again, I struggle to do it a bit with Adonis. I think the most important line here is Ghazian Ard al-Huruf, like invading the land of letters. And I'm not sure that Giorgiani's toolbox helps us to get through this. But then you take W.H. Auden's The Shield of Achilles, and suddenly Giorgiani's toolbox starts getting really useful and important. You know, she looked over his shoulder for vines and olive trees, marbled, well-governed cities, and ships upon inland seas. But there on the shining metal, like Giorgiani would be like, why did he use the first definite article occurs right down there, the shining metal? Like, what would the poem be like if it was a piece of shining metal? Like, what's the force of the definite article? Like, you can, like, Giorgiani's critical toolbox helps you read this poem. It doesn't help you read every aspect of it, but it helps you read it. And it was, of course, a literary toolbox designed for this kind of, for Bakhtari. So, the final question is whether a toolbox like Giorgiani's equips us to give a different kind of account of all kinds of poetry, and to split it into maybe two categories: poetry that Giorgiani works for and poetry that Giorgiani doesn't work for, or whether it just enables us to give a good account of particular kinds of poetry, and the process of testing which poetry it works on is an interesting one. And the underpinning critical move that I'm arguing for is this, like, who gets to be the literary critic question. Right? It doesn't always have to be the new critics, doesn't always have to be somebody working in English, it could be Giorgiani. Thank you.
Our second speaker is Hani Rashwan, organizer of this conference. Thank you for this. He is Andrew Mellon Fellow at the American University of Beirut. He received his PhD from London University, and his PhD dissertation under the title Literariness and Aesthetics of Ancient Egyptian Literature, Arabic Jinas in Post-Colonial Poetics is in press at American University of Cairo. The book offers the first study that compares ancient Egyptian literature with Arabic and literary device genres. He is speaking about rethinking Al-Jurjani's literary conditions of tajniz in relation to his Nazm theory.
Yes, thank you so much, Aida. Yeah. Thank you so much, Aida, and thanks for everyone to listen to my lecture. I hope it's enjoyable and it's not, it's good, success. Yeah, and I'm happy that I'm coming after Alexander K. So he paved the way for my presentation as well. My presentation today is divided into three sections, interrelated sections. The first part will tackle the Arabic understanding of balagha in comparison with the Greek-Roman rhetoric, and why balagha, it's okay. and why balagha can be easily misunderstood if we apply the Eurocentric modules that may affect the reading process of the Arabic literary persuasive devices. The second part will introduce the literary device tajnis and its various type. The third part will discuss the instructions or conditions that al-Jurjani offered to writers and literary critics to master the employment of this literary device. I would like to begin with here with James Murphy quotation that you may consider shocking, but it will help us to understand the different sides of studying and teaching what the Europeans call rhetoric. He's quoting him. It's important to note at once that rhetoric is an entirely Western phenomenon. As far as one can judge from surviving evidence, the Greeks were the only people of the ancient world who endeavored to analyze the ways in which human beings communicate with each other. There is no evidence of an interest in rhetoric in the ancient civilizations of Babylon or Egypt. For instance, neither Africa nor Asia has to this day produced a rhetoric. So, to understand what, he's actually a very well-known professor of Greek-Roman rhetoric, and I was honored to meet him in Berlin before 2 years. But to understand his background, we have to go to Aristotle's definition of rhetoric, which is the faculty of discovering in a given instance the available mean of persuasion, which we might paraphrase as the power to see the means of persuasion available in any given situation. In both Greece and Rome, the primary use of rhetoric was oratory, persuasion through public speaking. A person who could use rhetoric effectively was a person of power and influence because he could persuade his audience to action. Its main arenas are the courts of law and political forums. Many scholars raised their refusal to restrict the focus of rhetoric on instructions related to public oral speech and logical reasoning, as we see in the second quotations here. It is true, rhetoric derived from Greek philosophy is traditionally conceptualized as a method of persuasion through logical, rational argumentation. It is true that such oral rhetorical language is designed to have a persuasive or impressive effect, but many times is often regarded as lacking sensitivity or meaningful content. That's why we hear a lot the description of empty rhetoric. So we always hear all we have from the opposition is empty rhetoric. So it's here more about the oral practice and the lack of reasoning, coherent argument. So we take a look about the comparative rhetoric discipline. It's a new discipline. Deals with a study of rhetoric across different cultural traditions, but it seems to me that most of the Euro-American scholars started with the wrong methodology to understand and explain the persuasion systems of the other, depending on their own European understanding, placing the terminology and theories of Greek-Roman rhetoric not just as a convenient starting point, but also the limit of their inquiry. As a result, all the other rhetorical systems became ugly replica of the Greek-Roman one. So this is the main book of comparative rhetoric. So it's for George Kennedy, produced in 1908. He's speaking about rhetoric as a form of energy that drives and is imparted to communication. From Kennedy's perspective, the project is testing the applicability of Western rhetorical concepts outside of the West. And he also confirmed, like James Murphy and many other scholars of Western rhetoric, no other ancient culture develops a distinct focalized discipline of rhetoric to the degree found in the Greek-Roman tradition. And he goes even more further to claim that rhetoric exists between the animal communication. And he has like 10 or 15 pages about how animals can persuade each other and communicate. Apparently, the Euro-American modules of rhetoric suffer from many long-established problems that can easily misrepresent the non-Western cultures, as William Dominique here states. The term rhetoric has been associated with sophistry, tragedy, and vacuity, and has suggested to some critics a state in which language is separated from its context and becomes subrogatory. The most important here, even those scholars sensitive to the value of rhetoric as a linguistic and cultural force have generally found it difficult to produce insights equal to the critical role that rhetoric has played in history and the influence it has wielded in human society. So in Arabic, when we delve now to Arabic, the Arabic and the Greek-Roman culture have two distinct perspectives for viewing language and its rhetorical system as a result, differing in structuring their persuasive message. In Arabic, we can speak about two rhetorical systems that existed beside each other and influenced each other's growth. So Greek philosophical, which is khitaba, is mainly based on Plato and Aristotle's series and translations that deals with argumentation and regulation of public oral speech. This branch was mainly developed via the translation of Aristotle's book Organon into Arabic. The translation of Aristotelian book paved the way for Ilm al-Kalam, science of speaking, where the scholars seek Islamic reasoning through Aristotelian dialectics. It's clear to in many cases that the conservative Muslim scholars didn't favor this branch of khitaba, as it's clearly evident in one of the sayings claimed to be of Imam Shafi'i, ما جهل الناس ولا اختلفوا إلا لتركهم لسان العرب وميلهم إلى لسان Aristotelis. People didn't become ignorant nor differed except after their abandonment of the Arabic tongue and their inclination to the tongue of Aristotle. This quotation was mentioned in two sources, Al-Zahabi, Sayr al-A'lam, al-Nubala, and Sayuti, Sound al-Mantiq. Similarly, Ibn Taymiyyah claimed that al-Mantiq or logic had corrupted man in his quest for God's rida, acceptance or forgiveness, by the use of classical Greek logic. Ibn Taymiyyah asked the people to revert to the position taken by the early Muslim scholars, such as Imam Shafi'i, abandoning any later ideas that had been formed on the supportive basis of reasoning. So, what is Lisan al-Arab that al-Shafi'i and other scholars refer to? It is the Arabic literary poetics, or what is termed balagha, which mainly arouse from the text of the Quran, whose literary inimitability pushed the grammarians very early on the 9th and 10th century to enumerate, define, and classify the linguistic and grammatical peculiarities of the revelation. Abu Hilal al-Askari, here I'm quoting, confirmed in his introduction of the famous book of Balagha book, Kitab al-Sina'atayn, the learning and studying Balagha is the first priority for new believers, so they can rightly introduce to the unique features of God's words. اعلم علمك الله الخير ودلك عليه وقيده لك وجعلك من أهله. إن أحق العلوم بالتعلم وأولاها بالتحفظ بعد المعرفة بالله جل وثناؤه علم البلاغة ومعرفة الفصاحة الذي يعرف به إعجاز كتاب الله تعالى. Much of the Arabic scholarship related to Balagha originated from the continuous desire to work out a literary theory for interpreting the Quranic inevitability via its literary devices. Balagha intensively studies the material reality of the literary text itself, and by studying the literary devices and by studying the various literary forms, it paves the way for a better understanding of the general content and how the literary devices actually work to achieve the author's goal. I will give here a quick example of such linguistic features that are fundamental to producing eloquent literary language in Arabic. So this is from Surah Taha, when Moses asked by the God to demonstrate his great superiority by challenging the Pharaoh of Egypt. The expert magicians of the Pharaoh courts created a visual deception where the ropes and stuffs transformed to be moving like snakes. Moses got terrified so much inside himself, فَأَوْجَسَ خِيفَةٍ فِي نَفْسِهِ, and he thought that he would never be able to challenge their faultless magic. Then the God answered him, saying, لَا تَخَفْ إِنَّكَ أَنْتَ الْأَعْلَى. This verse repeats the second person pronoun 3 times. First one as a hidden pronoun, ضمير مستتر, in the negated verb لا تخف, and the prefix te attached to the present verb represents the second person, as a suffix pronoun attached to the Arabic confirmation device inna, indeed you are, as an independent separated pronoun for the second person singular, anta, The sacred voice here repeats the address pronoun 3 times to confirm that Moses, only Moses, was the only person who is entitled with this action of this sentence. In my translation of the verbs, the 3 repetitions of the same second singular pronoun are represented in the use of annonation alone. Moreover, in Ibn al-Asir, he was speaking about this Quranic verse, that it has 4 confirmation elements that have been waved together by the sacred voice to ensure that Moses emotionally feels the support of the God in facing the magicians of the pharaohs. First, giving an order using negation. Second, using the confirmation device inna. Repeating 3 different types of pronoun for the second singular person, using the superlative form of the adjective high. Such stylistic features are considered as the main component of what the Arabic balaghists call i'jaz, or what can be translated as poetic inimitability. And I get here like 4 translations of this verse, and we see how different and how the translation, how the notion of untranslatability can affect our understanding of i'jaz from the viewpoint of Arabic balagha. Here a quotation from Heinrich, speaking about the 3 genres we always face in Arabic, Quran, poetry, and ornate prose. And actually it's from Taha Hussein who begins this kind of divisions between the 3 genres. Between Quran has its own language, literary prose has its own, and poetry. And the only difference between literary prose and poetry is the arud, is the metric. Otherwise, there is no any difference between the 2 language itself. Grunbaum also, he said this fact about the difference between literary prose and poetry in Arabic culture. Balagha mostly doesn't consider the detailed relation between the author and the produced text or the literary genre of the text, but it deciphers the author's talent by evaluating the used literary devices and how the writer succeeds in meeting this literary taste expectation of the native receivers. This is the final division we all know from Sakaki, and after that was followed by Qazwini. But however, the early historical development of Balagha as a discipline went hand in hand with the other discipline of Nahr and Sarf. Ramzi Ba'al-Baki, he's a professor here in AUP, and he has a really brilliant article about the relation between Nahr and Balagha, a comparative study of the methods of Sibawayh and Jurjani. In this article, he speaks about the formation of Arabic Balagha was mainly related to Nahr and Sarf, with both Sibawayh and Jurjani. He argues that the modern separation between Nahr and Balagha is therefore unrealistic and should not be expected with the early scholars. Arabic tajnis. So tajnis as a term linguistically is derived from the noun jins, which means kind, sort, class. Jinas is a loan word derived from the Greek or Latin root genus, which means race, type, and gender. It has been transferred to Arabic language via the Syriac word jinisa. The word jins doesn't occur in the Quran, and the root jins is not found there at all. Nor are these used in pre-Islamic or early Arabic poetry. However, the concept of tajnis in Arabic balagha is fully Arabic and is more related to the nature of Arabic language. Jinas was mentioned in many early Arabic books like قواعد الشعر لأبو العباس أحمد بن يحيى ثعلب, كتاب البديع لعبد الله بن المعتز, كتاب نقد الشعر لقدامة بن جعفر, كتاب الصناعتين لأبو هلال العسكري, العمدة لابن رشيق القيرواني, أسرار البلاغة عبد القاهر الجرجاني. So, but also we have a full dedicated books only to study Jinas, which also referring how important this device for the Arabic literary critics. كتاب إجناس من كلام العرب للبغدادي, claimed to be Baghdadi, one of the earliest philological treatises of Arabic language. It contains more than 140 Jinas words with their different meanings. أجناس التجنيس لأبو منصور الثعلبي. Thank you for Professor Bilal for telling me about it. جنان الجناس للصفدي, جني الجناس للسيوطي, بلوغ العرب في علم الأدب, علم الجناس. This is a 17th century book by Germanius Farahat. So here I have a quotation from Safadi saying how beautiful is jinas, and he used most of the types of jinas in his quotation. So he devoted entire book to study of jinas, confirmed in his introduction that the major reason for understanding tajnis is to appreciate the superiority of Arabic language generally. He considered it as one of the main pillars of Badi'a. The Arabic poets and orators always acknowledge its significance in raising the quality of their speech, hence the professionalism can be examined via mastering this device. It's really hard to translate these quotations into Arabic because it's mainly very poetic, and using jinas is kind of difficult. It's a big study for untranslatability. So he's saying تشهد الخطباء له بفضل جماعته وجمعته وتعترف الشعراء برفع محله ومحل رفعته وتدخل به الألفاظ الأذن بغير إذن لشفاعة حقه وحق شفعته فله في كل خلوة جلوة وفي كل خطوة حظوة إن دخل في خطبة وجهها أو قصيدة دبجها أو شبهة روجها أو وضع في التروس نمقها أو نسخ كلمة جاء بخير منها وحققها فهو في البديع خال خده وتراز برده وظهر كمامه وقمر تمامه متى عد في القصيدة بيت كان الجناس طرازه ومتى طاف بالبلاغة متكلم كانت أركان كعبته وحجابه حجازه ومتى كان للسحر الحلال باب كان في الحقيقة إليه مجازه. So حقيقة here is a metaphorical language or the lexical accuracy as rightly Alexander K. meant. So I will go here quickly about the types of jinas to understand what is jinas when Abdul Qahir Jurjani speak about his advices or instructions. So first it's a jinas tam full jinas. I will just mention the two words in play. So I will not go through all the examples. ويوم تقوم الساعة يقسم المجرمون ما لبسوا غير ساعة. So here's a play between two words, the same word, ساعة, but the first word is a judgment, the day of judgment, and the other one it's a literal hour. ارعى الجار ولو جار. So the first one is mean the neighbor, and the other one is derived from the verb yagur, which is mean to be being oppressed or harsh and cruel treatment. Jinas muharraf, altered jinas, and this one related to the vocal movement of the Arabic, and it's only related to Arabic in this context. ولقد أرسلنا فيهم منذرين فانظر كيف كان عاقبة المنذرين. So the only difference here is the vowel mark on the zain letter. And it's changed, it's because of the grammatical situation of the word, i'rab. Also here, جناس ناقص أو غير تام مختلف البرد يمنع البرد. So البرد it's mean close, and البرد it's mean cold. Okay, so here's a play between the two words that have a different vocal mark, but also it has a different meanings at all. Here partial jinas, additional letter at the end, فلان حامل حامل لأعباء الأمور كاف كافل. So here they have just only one letter at the end, and this is what makes the difference between the two words. Another one is one letter in the middle, جدي جهدي. So here we have ha in the middle of the second word. كف بحر وجناب رحب. Here the difference between bahr and rahr. So they have a reversed order of the letter. And apparently Al-Wutwat, he's a Persian rhetorician, he wrote like more than 15 types of reversed jinas based on the Persian language nature. في partial reversed jinas اللهم أستر عوراتي وآمن روعاتي. The most famous type of jinas in Arabic, morphological jinas. جناس الاشتقاق. لا أعبد ما تعبدون ولا أنتم عابدون ما أعبد ولا أنا عابد ما عبدتم ولا أنتم عابدون ما أعبد. Okay, just one root, and he's using different grammatical situation with each root to change the meaning. ومكروا مكرا ومكرنا مكرا وهم لا يشعرون. There is another type, it's related, it's called جناس شبه الاشتقاق, semi-morphological تجنيس. This is when you have the two words and they have the same root, but this same root has only a vowel marker to differentiate between the two words. So we have here example, إنه ذهب وأخاف أن تذهب ولكن خذ هذا العود لعلك تعود. So it was a context that a beloved boy, he asked for a souvenir from his beloved girl and she wanted to escape from his request. So she gave him, he asked for her ring. She said, إنه ذهب, this gold, وأخاف أن تذهب, I'm scared that you will go away or go far and you will not come back. So the play here between ذهب, gold, and تذهب, ذهب, to mean go away. عود, it means a wooden stick, and تعود, to come back. Resembles جناس, الجناس المضارع. Here two words, but the only different letter is a letter related to the same articulation source. So ليل دامس وطريق طامس. The play here between دال and طاء, and they came from the same articulation source. There is another type, non-resemblance جناس, جناس اللاحق. This is one of the titles of the medieval books about medicine. عيون الأنباء في طبقات الأطباء. الأنباء والأطباء. So here's the difference between noon and ta. Beginning letter جناس أو الجناس الاستهلالي, it doesn't exist in classical Arabic بلاغة, only in modern treatments. ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما. فا. Okay, and it's related to alliteration. Visual جناس. So here visual جناس is related more to the eye and also to the ear. So two words, but they have one different letter, and this different letter orthographically is related to the to another shape. So we speak about ب والت والس with noon. We speak about sin and sheen. Only the points is the difference between the two letters. Like if you say والذي هو يطعمني ويسقين وإذا مرضت فهو يشفين. يسقين and يشفين. The only two difference is sin and sheen. Only the points. So I saw the Safadi. He was the only one who actually gets these points. Actually, after they created the pointing system by Abi al-Aswad al-Du'ali and al-Khalil, but actually al-Sa'labi in أجناس التجنيس, he has هو عين الباصرة وهو يد الناصرة. الباصرة والناصرة, الباء والنون, والركن الوثيق والشقيق الشفيق. And there is one famous poetry from Maqamat al-Hariri, Aleppo part, and he also play a lot with this kind of points. زينت زينت زينب بقد يقد. So زينت and زينب. So the only difference is ta and ba. بقد يقد وتلاه وإله نهد يهد. To understand this kind of types, to better understand the function of tajnees, I try to organize these different types according to the relation between the two words, based on their main characters, which reflect the interleaving connection of the three main components of the human language: sound, ear; sense, mind; visual, eye. In defining the nature of tajnees, hence getting closer to their main intended function for the readers or listeners. So I divided them into 4 categories. The first one, sound-based, and this includes these types. This category represents the types that depend mainly on producing sound effects and are empty of content. They are not structured to highlight a semantic relationship between tajnees words. Since sound-based, full jinas, and this type of jinas, and this is what will Jurjani speak about in his instruction. This category represents type in which the writer can combine both sound and meaning in order to highlight or concentrate the mind's focus on what the author wants to draw to the attention of the receivers. And the third one, sense-based, only sense. It has no sound effect. And depends only on allegorical implied meaning between two different words, and the reader thus has been left to decipher the intended message. Its main function related only to stimulating the mind. This category contains semantic genus and other two types. And the final category here is sound visual based. This category is only related to the Arabic script, where the writer plays with two similar words phonetically, but there is one different letter in both of them. These two different letters are visually similar in terms of their writing shapes. Its main function is thus related to the ear and the eye of the reader or the listener. When we go to Abdul Qahir al-Jurjani instruction, as we showed earlier, the increased passion of using tajnees has encouraged literary critics to give advice about how to master playing with this literary device, mainly by avoiding vocalic ornaments while giving more importance to the semantic side. Most critics have confirmed that nothing is more futile than irrelevant tajnees that is based only on phonetic similarity and where there is no contrast or congruity of meaning. Nothing is clearer sign of unskilled writing than tajnees play that distract rather than concentrates the reader's attention. The Persian Arabist Abdul Qahir al-Jurjani, in his famous book Asrar al-Balagha, Secrets of Balagha, considered tajnees one of the most beautiful jewels in Arabic poetry and confirms the important consideration listed here that makes sense sound, only sense sound-based tajnees acceptable to literary critics and listener in its literary effectiveness. So the first one, ما يعطي التجنيس من فضيلة أمر لم يتم إلا بنصرة المعنى إذ لو كان اللفظ لوحده لما كان فيه إلا مستحسن ولما وجد فيه معيب مستهجن ولذا ذم الاستكثار منه والولوع به وذلك أن المعاني لا تدين في كل موضوع لما يجذبها التجنيس إذ الألفاظ خدم المعاني والمصرفة في حكمها وكانت المعاني هي المالكة في سياستها والمستحقة طاعتها. He's referring to the semantic flawlessness of tajnees content must walk arm in arm with its innovative vocalic form. The flowing context should support the related semantic relationship between the two tajnees words. In other words, in order to make the mind, al-aql, appreciate its semantic message. Al-Jurjani asks the composers to establish the required balance between the musical effect on the ear and the logical coherence of using those tajnees words inside the context. This then helps the authors avoid producing an echo of repeated letters without any benefit of serving the context, thus turning tajnees into an illogical literary employment. He believes that repeated utterance of the vocal form, loves itself, is not of any use to the context, without its coherent position semantically inside the described context. He considers the articulation of the vocal form to be a servant of its semantic role inside the text, not the opposite. He confirmed that literary tajnees can be easily judged by examining the semantic coherence that exists between tajnees words. Another aspect in the second paragraph, Al-Jurjani attacks this careless attitude which reflects the weak literary talent of taste of its author by reminding them that they speak to make the receiver understand, which is why anyone should communicate in coherent way, only to make clear what he means. He uses a logical simile to support his literary criticism and to better explain the poor impact of such excessive care of the vocalic ornaments. He links the unbearable literary attitude in speech to someone who wants to make the bride look more beautiful on her wedding feast by forcing her to wear many types of beautiful heavy jewels, which results in harming the bride itself. Another instruction, the literary aim behind combining both genus words should not be too difficult to decipher for both reader and audience. The implied literary message should be easily imaginable, as the writer should provide sufficient description of particularized metaphorical relations so that the reader can easily decode it. Tajnees plays should ease the literary reading of its whole verse, not complicate it. Tajnees should be a part of a spontaneous inspiration. The context asks for its existence without its being imposed. Al-Jurjani stresses the role of literary imagination and how it positively or negatively affects the relationship between the content and the form. He confirms that the talented authors will spontaneously produce such literary innovations without previous complicated decision in their mind. If tajnis is premeditated by the author, it will mostly affect the efficiency of the produced meaning negatively. Tajnis should be requested by the context. And the last one, such instruction about tajnis can be linked with the Jurjani reformation of the literary and grammatical studies of his time under the term of nazm. He is confirming again that the mere meaning of words and their grammatical inflections is not significant. A word possesses a merit only in combination with other words and in the establishment of harmony between its meaning and the significance of its neighboring words. I'm asking here a quick questions about how to translate tajnis in the European languages. To better understand the confusing dilemma about Arabic balagha in general and tajnis in European studies, we have to understand the ancient Greek and modern Western comprehension of their common terms. The history of the English term bun can perfectly illustrate the contradictions in what at first seem a fairly clear-cut history for modern Western studies. The inconsistent conjectures about the early root of the term bun emphasize the difficulty that covers its early etymological meaning and thus provoke many uncertain speculations about its early reception and function as a literary rhetorical device. Bun usually in the English-speaking world regarded as a very low form of humor, and they are particularly fearful of the obscene bun, which is a major variety of the form. So it's kind of the familiarity that English readers feel towards what is called bun, in part due to Shakespeare writing, the England national poet who lived from 1564 to 1660. However, the earliest record use of the word bun cannot go farther than 1660, mainly in the work of the English literary critic and poet John Dryden. It thus means that all the known definitions of the term bun that exist in the English dictionaries are based on the modern reader's knowledge of what puns are, and dictionaries seem to authenticate what they already know. It means also that most of the European languages, with their historical ancestors and even Shakespeare himself, weren't familiar with the word and its modern English concepts at all. Joseph Dame demonstrates such fact in his critical treatment of pun and its equivalent, paronomasia and quibble, during the 17th and 18th centuries, and how its historical concept look elusive and vague in the three imperial languages of Europe, English, German, and French. For the English word pun, there are neither cognates nor conceptual equivalents in other European language. In German, the best one can do is Wortspiele, but this is clearly a much broader term than ours. Does this mean that puns don't exist in German literature? Or does it simply mean that there is no way to point them or to conceptualize them? In French, the closest one can come is calembour, and this word attracts some of the same critical disparagement as the English word pun. So it's here I'm presenting a question. I'm presenting a quotation here from a well-known professor of Egyptology who explains the dilemma of ancient Egyptian stylistic analysis. So I'm going back to my old religion, but here I'm using this quote to answer with another dilemma we have in Arabic. To explain the dilemma of ancient Egyptian stylistic analysis and conflict between emic and ethic methodology in describing the literary devices of a foreign culture, assuming the absence of native terms in ancient Egypt, which is not fully true, as there are many ancient Egyptian literary terms that were overlooked because of such Eurocentric methodology. Antonio Labrini here is speaking about a conceptual dilemma inherent in trying to write on stylistic or rhetoric devices of a culture whose views on language are very remote from our own, as it is in case for ancient Egypt. We find ourselves in quandary between two poles. On the one hand, we want to identify as precisely as possible these devices amicably within the frame of reference provided by that culture's own linguistic or literary practice. So on the other side, we have in Arabic, we have a huge amount of terms and literary concepts, but in a similar way, Van Gelder and Marley Hamoud, and they are very close friends and closer, overlooked the Arabic balagha terms in their book Takhil, the imaginary in classic Arabic poetic, and heavily depend on English quotations that may actually mislead the reader, as Rebecca Gold explained in her review, to that English equivalent of Arabic balagha terms can easily misinform the reader comprehension of the Arabic literary practice. I will end here my presentation with a quotation of the Russian formalist Mikhail Bakhtin, speaking about how important to reactivate the differentiation in order to have a closer access to better stylistic analysis. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you. Now you can to ask each other if you have questions. Do you have question? No. Do you have question to me? Can I ask? I just wanted to note that in Azeri Turkic literature, we have genre of tajniz, not device of balagha. This is some kind of folk literature, poems, which has a lot of jinas devices. Whether or not in Arabic, some of your ulama of balagha called tajniz like fan, laysa badi. And second, it is very interesting to me to know. Also, we say that Allah allazi la yashu, this in hazani lasahirani. How explained Arabic ulama of balagha this era, Quranic era? Maybe you know this is not related to that tajniz, but this is era. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. I think from my experience in comparing ancient Egyptian with Arabic, I realized that I was kind of having like brainwashed that Arabic can answer all the questions of other languages. But after that, I realized that each word, each language can speak of their own types according to their own nature. So I do believe that tajniz in Persian has different types according to their employment and their usage, and also in comparison with the Turkish, in comparison with other languages. And actually it's very clear in modern European languages that Tan is not in English, is not Wortspiele in German, and is not the equivalent in French as well. And yeah, I was saying that in the modern European languages, it's very obvious that each language has its own module of wordplay according to its nature. And the direct link between ancient Greek and Latin and these three European languages, it's a fake line. It doesn't exist. So if we begin with Paranomasia, it has a completely different nature of bun in English. So what we are trying to do is we have to give each language its right to produce its own buns. We don't impose or don't expect that the Arabic jinas types will be the same in Persian or Turkish or Azeri. Yeah.
But tajniz, maybe some scholars also think tajniz is genre not device of balagha. I just wanted to know because tashbih, according to Qudama ibn Jahbar, fan min funun, genre, but tajnis, how tajnis? This is only badi or?
Yeah, it's part of Muhsinat. So how to beautify the ocean. And also it's defined as a language, so Muhsinat Ma'nawiyya. So it's great between the two, but it's part of the crucial part, like Saja of Badi'a, Ilm al-Badi'a. Actually, Ibn al-Mu'taz who began to list it, Jinas under Badi'a, and after that all the Balagha sources.
In Hazan Lasahiran. Error, yes? This is error, Quranic error.
Yeah, Saja. It's, yeah. It's not Jinas. Yeah.
Grammatical error in the Quran. Yes?
I didn't fully.
Yes,
Yeah.
this is error. We have accepted in Hazan, after in, we usually use verb, yes?
Yeah.
Could I? I think I would just add two. It's a really interesting discussion. I think I would add two things that I think actually it's the same point actually when I think about it, because the point about in Dani Sahirain is that the grammar is constructed on the basis of the shawahid. The shawahid are the linguistic anthropology with native speakers, the Quran, and pre-Islamic poetry. So it's like a feedback loop. So you can't have an incorrect grammar when grammar is a human epistemological structure, like set up on the basis of a divine text and linguistic fieldwork. And the problem is this like categorization problem. I think what I would add to what Hani was saying about Jinas and translation is that when it comes to untranslatability, the untranslatability is in the taxonomy. Like it's this process of taxonomizing the different kinds of Jinas that introduces a degree of untranslatability, because you can taxonomize it so tightly that you produce a certain kind of Jinas that is only in one language. But for the theorists themselves, like people like Abdul Qahir, they saw the underlying dynamics of Jinas itself, just like the underlying dynamics of metaphor, as being applicable to all languages. It's just there's this tension between like identifying the dynamics that are applicable across languages, which is what people like Giorgiani were doing, and then taxonomizing to an extent that untranslatability appears.
Yes, so I had a comment and a question regarding translatability, but before, I had a comment on the grammatical error. I think it's tricky to talk about grammatical error when grammar is not settled and doesn't really exist yet. So I don't know. It's an anachronism, I think, to talk about it as a grammatical error. But I had a question about translatability and the equivalence you were talking about, Hani. Maybe the translatability of tajnis is not to find in existing equivalents, but in recreating words that would express what it means. Maybe it's possible to look into, I don't know, gender studies, for example, to find this kind of equivalence of how you change the genre of the word or the nature of the word, or etc., etc. So my question is, because you at the same time were trying to translate and find equivalence, and said that you think that every word, every concept and word and theoretical aspect has to be read within its own language and literature and tradition. But so what would be your position on translatability, like per se, like how, if we go beyond the equivalent translation, what do you think? Can we?
If I understand your question correctly, you are speaking about translating terms of each language.
Yes, I mean with concepts, like meaning the concept and its definition.
Yeah.
Obviously.
So this is one of a major research about concept untranslatability. So if we just translate it literally, we kill the term, which was produced by the intellectual of this culture. I mean, if we see how we deal with rhetoric in the English world and in comparison with balagha in the Arabic world, it's completely different words. So we don't want to have like automatic misunderstanding. Like if you have in your mind, pun is the lowest form of wit, and after that you analyze jinas in Quran using pun. So you already have this kind of prepared decision.
Yes, but that's exactly what I said, is that without using pre-existing equivalents, to try and translate by creating words that are, or adapting words from other studies that are applicable and maybe understandable, because, I don't know, it just... Can I?
Yeah, Alexander wants to comment.
Yeah, thanks. I can just jump in on Henny's question. Yeah, I think it's an important, the question of conceptual translation of theory is a really important one. What I found most useful here was Thomas Kuhn, the person who's famous for the book about the Copernican revolution and like the progression of science. He also has some stuff on like translation theory, and he makes this argument about core conceptual vocabulary, whereby you can't get out of the fact that there are a certain set of core words in a particular language that's being used at a particular time that have their genealogies that all affect each other, and that's on some level the only way to transfer it is in effect to relearn a new language. So it's like you can't understand Einstein's theory of relativity unless you know what Newton meant when he said gravity. Like you can't understand what Abdul Qahir is doing in Henny's quote about lafz and ma'ana and al-alfaz khidam al-ma'ani unless you know the prehistory of ma'ana and you know the history of that literary critical argument. I mean, yeah, it's like, it's not that it's untranslatable, it's just that these conversations are. And it's not just that it's single terms either. It's like a conversation that happens in a set of linguistic practices that you have to like.
Okay, so I do agree with you, Alexander, what you originally said about looking at the underlying concept of metaphor, because here metaphor, I think, is a translatable term. So if I were to think of jinas, I could think of jinas as a form of metaphor, broadly speaking, and then taxonomize metaphors in the world where jinas would fall under one form of metaphor that is specific to the Arabic language because of ishtiqaq, because of the diacritic, because of all these specificities of Arabic that make it possible to create these types of jinas. In other languages you can't. But also, I mean, this is a conversation that has never really happened in isolation. So there's not like, as you were saying, Hani, this is not a conversation that was just happening in Arabic. It is a conversation that is, at the outset, has happened with Greek and with Persian and with other languages. And as I know from your research, also with pharaonic languages. So this is at the outset, this is a conversation that is multilingual, and translatability. I mean, what do we get out of saying that something is translatable or untranslatable? What we get, I think, is this kind of conversation. This is like, well, it's untranslatable because I'm going to tell you why, because of the very specific structure of the Arabic language. But in the end, ultimately, I do come to a place of translatability when I call it metaphor again. So what I'm looking at is how I displace meaning, how I generate meaning through displacements, yes? And this is a general theory of metaphor that could apply to Ginas, could apply to pun, it could apply to many other things. If Ginas then is translated as pun in other, then it would be a bad translation, as you say. Of course I can't call what is happening in the Quran as pun. That's just, it's a bad translation. But calling it a metaphor is not a bad translation. It's actually a very good translation, even if it does not cover the specificity of the term.
But if everything is metaphor, what conceptual use does it have?
Not everything is metaphor.
Metaphor is a particular kind of metaphor. What you mean is trope, right? Because metaphor is not just the general name for figure of language. Metaphor is a particular kind of figurative language which generates meaning, as you said, through displacement. But we can't encapsulate suddenly all modes of figurative language under this proper name without losing anything. And I think, at any rate, I think even in this particular context, we don't need to get the most fashionable and trendy theorists of untranslatability in the room. I don't think anyone means by untranslatability kind of issuing an injunction on any attempt of translation. In fact, even in this conversation, it's used as a generative term. At least that's what I thought. Like you said, it generates certain kinds of conversations. Would you rather not have these conversations?
No,
would you rather not think about?
I think we're misunderstanding what I was saying. In terms of tajnis, I think Ginas is metaphor. I'm not saying all figures of language. That's how I do think of it in terms of displacement, the generation of meaning through displacement. I don't know. I mean.
Sorry, I am totally agree with Professor Veli when said that, of course, when we talk about problems related with translations, we make reference to a germinative level of increase. So I guess that anyone said that it's impossible to translate. But probably the most important thing is to try to explain. I think that instead of translate terms, we can provide for each work a technical glossary, and we try to explain terms. About Ginas, in Arabic rhetoric is not a metaphor at all, because metaphor or that kind of process that are called based on similarity or contiguity, which in Western rhetoric gives a rise in metaphors and metonymies, are an ambit of ilm al-bayan, in which all the figures, tashbih, isti'ara, kinaya, and majaz, are governed, we can say, by two important processes, ithbat and muthbat. So Ginas has no relationship with them, and it doesn't include a process built on similarity or ontological similarity and ontological contiguity. The allophony or the alliteration, or we can use several Western figures of speech to express Ginas, because Ginas has not a specific counterpart in Western rhetoric. But anyway, it's a linkages among letters and among sounds that has a reflection also in meaning, but it is not linked with an ontological process built on similarity or contiguity. I think that we are trying to apply to Arabic rhetoric some universals of modern Western thinking that I think, and this is my opinion, has no linkage with the Arabic rhetorical tradition. So we mixed up two levels, but without taking into account centuries that there's ongoing, and without taking into account changing in perspective. So I modestly think that we have to find an approach that is cross-temporal, but that every time takes into account these very differences, and that al-balagha is an ongoing process, and we cannot read it on the very basis or the theories that we have now.
Could I just add that I think this is a really important conversation. The reason I just put this slide up because Elahi kind of has an answer to this problem, which is if you look at this Arabic and Persian, like the gap is huge. Like the words have all changed. And yet it's also very clearly a translation. I mean, it's kind of that same question about metaphor. Like I don't think this is failing, and I'm not sure that, and I don't think that saying metaphor is jeunesse is failing either. Like the scale of the differences is huge, but.
Yes, sorry. To react to what you said and also go back. I don't think by talking about translatability we are being Eurocentric. I think if we're going to think about global theory and we want the Tajnis to be part of what is going to help us building a global literary theory, we have to think about translatability, not in terms of equivalence, but in terms of maybe a series of possible nuances and equivalents that are going to, because saying this is one culture, this is one language, we can't adapt it, we can't produce it in another language, is the contrary of trying to use those rhetorics, the balagha, as participation to the global theory. And this is why I was asking the question to Hani about what was his position on translatability, not because I wanted to create a but just because I wanted to ask, how do we do that? How do we, practically?
Can you ask a question? Dr. Rebecca, please.
Okay, this is also in some way translatability related, but it's turning the conversation in a different direction. And I had comments on both of your fabulous presentations, if I could, or questions. I'll ask them together if it's okay. So I'll ask my question, Hani. I wonder, you gave the example of Giorgiani having what I sense was a kind of hierarchy of the different Tajnis, but that seemed to be the only example I took, like in terms of a normative hierarchy. And I was just wondering, can you speak more within the Balagha tradition about normative approaches to Tajnis? In other words, efforts to say this is better, this is worse, to kind of create an aesthetic hierarchy. And then Alexander, I both very much agree and very much disagree with the same great point about the sort of applicability of Giorgiani. So maybe to first say the agreement. Okay, so I agree that there's a limit when it comes to certain kinds of poetics, certain kinds of poetry. And I would say the nature of that limit is very interesting. For me, it revolves around the question of silence. So I'd be very interested to hear other perspectives, but I'm thinking sort of through the history of Balagha, I don't know if there's a conceptual space for really thinking about how silence works in poetry. But in modern poetry, I think you could even argue that sometimes silence is more important than meaning, and so there's a perception, I think, since modernity, we are very skeptical of language having meaning, and it seems that poetic beauty, for me as a reader of modern poetry, depends on my skepticism, right? So I go to poetry to find things confused and distorted, and that's not something I think that the Giorgiani toolbox gives us. However, disagreement. I think that Giorgiani, it's been a while since I've really immersed myself in the text, but as I recall, when he has this hierarchy of different tashbih, different kinds of tashbih, right? And he talks about which is superior to others. And I can't remember which book it's from, but he talks about he's focusing on the mental exertion that the reader has to engage in order to so the indirect kind of metaphor that you were describing, or tashbih, I guess you would call it, that is superior precisely because it requires greater mental exertion. So there's this, I think, idea of kind of indirect literary meaning where the sign and the signifier are separated, and where the poet expects us to appreciate that is actually better. And that to me is something that's very translatable. I mean, that applies to 21st century poetics, it applies to 11th century poetics. So I would say the kind of applicability of Giorgiani may have more to do with actually the aesthetic experience itself than with the text. So that's more of a comment, but yeah.
Yeah, I think I would just say, I'm going to copy you and be like, agree, disagree. I'm going to say very briefly that I think you're absolutely right. I'd say that Giorgiani is trying to analyze affect. Like, it's emotional. What he's interested in is emotional impact, and he's trying to explain how emotional impact happens. And I think you're absolutely right, that argument that he makes in multiple different areas, that a bit more work, or he talks in terms of time it takes to get through a sentence, like syntax time, like a little bit more syntax time and a little bit more work gives you more affect. And I think you're absolutely right. Like, you could use that when you think about how long it takes to think about what Bijan Elahi is doing here. Like, that time would be something that you could use Giorgiani to talk about. The only thing I disagree with is I don't think it's a matter of separation between a signifier and a signified.
Okay.
Yeah. I think Giorgiani, he didn't offer a typology of different type of genus. So he was mainly interested in the sense-sound-based genus.
Didn't he say it was better though, or did I miss that part of your quote?
Yeah, his quotations is favoring one against others, and the other who care more about the excessive vocal ornamentation over the context, over the meaning itself. And actually, I think it was a reaction of Musallasat Qutb. So Qutb, he was a Sibawayh student. So he created this kind of, I don't call it poetry, but it's a play between three words, very similar words, but they have one vocal mark different in the first letter. So like salam, it's mean peace, and also silam, it's mean small rocks, and sulam, it's the finger's bone. So people use this kind of three words to make like a verse or something. So they have already the dictionary in front of them, and they're trying to make. So this is what he was criticizing. He wanted to be spontaneous, to the meaning asking for the words he used, not the words asking for constructing the word of the verse.
To our speakers, I really enjoy. Yes, because it is time. We have we already 10 minutes late. We are late. Only one question. Only one question.
I mean, this speaks, I don't know if I can be brief, but I'll try. I think we've been talking about translatability, but I think I agree with what you said in the sense of what we need is conceptualization, not just we're not, it doesn't matter how we translate, but we need to come up with definitions with the translations that we use and see how they are applicable. And I think this takes me to the question of the relation between Aristotelian rhetoric and poetics in the Arabic context. I think we should not completely dismiss that, because unless we're coming from a modern context, how Aristotelian rhetoric and poetics is thought today. But when we look at Arabic philosophers, they were in fact very much aware of all these problems that we are discussing, and they do come up with certain ways. I mean, they try to expand the realm of Aristotelian rhetoric to include a lot of the Arabic context, and they come up with purposes. So the purpose of rhetoric is different from the purpose of poetics, although they use certain things. But this takes me back to the bundles of meaning that, Alex, you've mentioned. If you could probably say a little bit more, how do you conceptualize these bundles of, how do you see Georgianian understanding of this? Because if we look at how majaz and haqiqa, the conceptualization of the relation speaks to this certain similarity, but there's also a question of philosophy of language in terms of the imposition, and how do you kind of the spectrum that you can go far from these various meanings. So could you say more about that bundles of meaning, and how is it formalistic? Is that, if I understood you correctly?
Very short answer, very short.
I think I would just say I agree with everything that Farial said. The Giorgiani talks about ma'ani, plural, that come from a single lafz, and he does this a lot. And bundles is my translation edition to explain how these ma'ani come as plural for him.
Thank you.